I don't use exchanges anymore to buy Bitcoin. When I do any form of work, I just get paid in Bitcoin and that's it. And what that does is it starts to actually drive up the circular economy. Honestly, sometimes the best way to learn something is to go and build something. And whether that's a product or a business or whatever, doesn't matter, but like go and build. Because as you build, you necessarily have to figure the thing out. It'll reach mass adoption long before Bitcoin does. And it's probably the biggest opportunity that the whole world's sleeping on right now.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for coming on the show. Can you please introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure. So I think most people, if they have heard of me, have probably heard of me through like podcasts or writing and things like that I do. But my experience in history has more been entrepreneurial in nature. So I went to university, studied as a civil engineer, dropped out, put all my money on the stock market instead. I turned $3,000 into about $60,000 in a space of 6 months, and I thought I was a genius. So I, got my spreadsheet out and I projected forward, and I thought, damn, by the time I'm 25, I'll be a billionaire. Watch out, Warren Buffett. Here I come. And yeah, by the time I was 21, this is 2007, 2008, I lost everything and more. And I basically started my 20s $250,000 in debt. And this is, almost 20 years ago now, which back then $250,000 actually meant something. Today it's basically means nothing. And yeah, that sort of put me on an entrepreneurial journey. And the only way for me to pay my debts at the time to the banks was to go door-to-door sales and do a commission-only job. And that's where I kicked off. That's where I started. And I built from there. I built many different businesses, some that succeeded, some that failed. And in 2015, 16, stumbled into Bitcoin. So it's been almost a decade now. And I went on to build the world's first Bitcoin savings app. So, these days you have like Swan and Relay, and there's all sorts of applications out there that are really geared around like helping people buy, acquire, and save Bitcoin. And we were the first ones to pioneer that as a concept back in 2017, and everyone was laughing at me at the time. And yeah, I exited that company about 2 years ago. I went on to focus more on writing. I got married, things like that. I'm just about to publish a second book. And yeah, last year, we'll discuss this later in the podcast, but I went down the AI rabbit hole for a little bit, realized that 99% of the AI stuff is all a scam. And now I'm squarely building a product specifically in the Nostr space, which in some way came about, thankfully, from my journey down the AI rabbit hole. But I realized, and I've come to realize that Nostr is extremely, extremely, extremely important. And in fact, probably the biggest thing. It'll reach mass adoption long before Bitcoin does. And it's probably the biggest opportunity that the whole world's sleeping on right now. So that's an overview.
Okay, wow, lots of things to cover then. Perhaps let's start by your Bitcoin journey. So when you start after trying the entrepreneurial route and stumbling into Bitcoin, how did you become a Bitcoiner?
Yeah, so I've always been a curious kid, pretty well read, history, economics, politics, philosophy, all this sort of stuff. And I'd heard it. So I was a gold bug after I lost everything on the stock market. So back in 2009, 2010, 2011, I was buying gold and silver, and I made a lot of money out of that. I did quite well. And the people that I was listening to were the Mike Maloneys, the Doug Cases, the Max Kaisers of the world. And it was around that time when I first heard about Bitcoin, 2010, 2011. And I just brushed it off. I was like, yeah, whatever, who cares? And I think it was like Max Kaiser jumping up and down on a couch yelling about Bitcoin. And I went and I was building other businesses. And it wasn't until 2015 again, late 2015, early 2016, that this friend of mine who, let's just say he was a bit of a degenerate. And he was like, oh, bro, have you heard about this Bitcoin thing? And I was like, yeah, a while back. I was like, is that thing still around? He's like, yeah, man, my friend made millions of dollars out of it, blah, blah, blah. And I remember just looking at the price, and it was like $600. And I had remembered it from like when Max was yelling about it for like a couple dollars. And I was like, holy crap, like what did I miss out on here? And that, I guess incentivized me in some way, or it like enticed me to go and start digging a little bit. Luckily enough, I found Andreas Antonopoulos quite early. The more I dug, the more I realized there was something profound here. Now, I call the journey into shitcoining climbing Mount Stupid. So I, like many others, climbed Mount Stupid, and I just happened to realize it was all stupidity up there, and I came down very quickly. So I had my little shitcoin period in late 2016, 2017, realized it was all stupidity, and very quickly came to the conclusion that Bitcoin is incredibly important, incredibly unique, and what it represents for the world, this idea of a sound monetary standard with a bearer instrument that is essentially like it's digital cash, that I can use as a perfect medium of exchange, meaning I don't need permission from anybody to transact or to trade, and nobody can inflate my purchasing power away. So we have a fixed standard for a monetary base. I realized that was extremely important, and I started writing about Bitcoin at the same time as I was thinking about what to do with it. And the idea just hit me. I remember like a ton of bricks. I was sitting there thinking, man, everybody thinks Bitcoin is for trading. I was like, no, it's not. Bitcoin is like discovering Bitcoin today is like discovering gold 5,000 years ago, and it hasn't been priced in yet. And imagine if you could somehow live 5,000 years and you could find gold on the ground from the beginning while everybody was still using seashells and rocks for trading. And you could pick up a piece of gold for nothing, for zero, because it's lying around on the ground, and you could collect it, collect it, collect it, collect it. And within 5,000 years, you could own kingdoms and lands and countries. I sort of understood Bitcoin as the same thing, but except it'll monetize within the space of a century or two. So I came up with the idea. I said, look, we don't need another Bitcoin or crypto trading app. What we need is a Bitcoin savings application. So in 2017, I founded a company called Amber, which was the first Bitcoin savings app of its kind in the world, and the rest is history. But that was essentially my journey, my aha moment of Bitcoin.
Since you did a lot of writing, a lot of thinking around this specific idea, like the example you gave, I think you have a unique perspective being a gold bug stepping into Bitcoin. I would say your brain already 90% wired to adopt it, basically. And there is still, in this world, a lot of resistance and a lot of ignorance around that. And if you look at the adoption rate, basically, you see a lot more trading going on Bitcoin rather
Mm-hmm.
than adoption or real people operating businesses, accepting Bitcoin, paying in Bitcoin, and so
Mm-hmm.
on. How do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, that's so easy to explain. I wrote an article about 2 years ago called "The Three Generations Theory," and I recommend everyone go in, like, have a quick read of that. And I discuss how it'll take at minimum 60 years for Bitcoin to saturate the global economy, and probably even more than that. But I break it up into three periods, three generations, and a generation is roughly 20 years, right? You and I are part of the first generation of Bitcoiners. We were alive before Bitcoin existed, which means our brain is wired as part of the fiat economy, the fiat system, where everything is measured in US dollars, and that's the standard, right? We fundamentally perceive Bitcoin, even though some of us have, say we've reached Bitcoin nirvana and we see the world in Bitcoin. It's fundamentally speaking, we perceive Bitcoin in relation to the existing world. Like we have one foot in the old, one foot in the new, and this first generation of Bitcoiners will basically, like the age we're living in, this first, like, call it 2010 to 2030, is the age of speculation. It is when Bitcoin is finding its footing and finding its place in the broad monetary ecosystem of the world. The next generation, kids who were born after Bitcoin was around, so 2009, 2010, etc., as they come of age, 2030 onwards, when they're 20 years old, they're not going to know of a time before Bitcoin. They don't know of a world where, a thing called fiat reigned supreme, right? For them, like, Bitcoin is Bitcoin. It's a normal thing. By then, 2030 onwards, it's probably going to be worth $1 million or whatever or more. They will perceive Bitcoin differently, and they will behave differently with it. They will find more utility in its operation, perhaps as a medium of exchange, perhaps as a technical layer, perhaps as something to do with what you're considering more traditional adoption as instead of speculative adoption. So they will usher in a new era of Bitcoin, and that's going to last 20 years. It's going to be more functional, more utility oriented. And then if you think about their generation, they're going to have kids that are born from 2030 onwards who come of age in the year 2050. When they become 20-year-olds, capital allocators, entrepreneurs, and everything, they will have completely no memory of fiat because they were born 20 years after fiat and they come of age 40 years after. They will do something completely different with Bitcoin. So we have to sort of wait these 3 generations. And that couples very nicely with the fact that in order for Bitcoin to be widely used as a medium of exchange, it needs to be less volatile than it is today. But in order for it to be less volatile than it is today, it needs to have a much greater economic mass. Now, the only way for its economic mass to increase is for more people to acquire it. The more people that acquire it, the more volatile it's going to be because that's going to move the price up and down and around in circles. So we just have to go through this speculative phase. We have to go through this monetization phase, through this volatile phase, in order for it to reach the maturity and mass that is needed. And at the same time, the generations that grew up in the fiat world that have come into Bitcoin, we need to basically die off. You and me need to die. Like, we need to get the fuck out of the way, basically. And I'm sorry for swearing, but we need to get out of the way so that the new generations who perceive and understand it differently can use it differently. That's it. It's just, we're not talking about, like, Bitcoin is not an iPhone. Like, and this is what a lot of people forget. They project a technological adoption curve onto Bitcoin. That's not what it is. Bitcoin is a techno socioeconomic phenomenon. It's way bigger than an iPhone. Like, your cost of getting selecting the wrong phone. Like, if you bet on an iPhone and it's not the thing that you expected it, you lose $1,000. If you go and bet your wealth, your community's wealth, your nation's wealth, your city's wealth, your company's wealth on this thing called Bitcoin, and you're wrong, you lose everything. So the gravity of the decision is extraordinarily large. But that goes to show how fundamentally important Bitcoin is. So it's not gonna happen in our lifetimes. We're not gonna get to the point where merchants and people and all this sort of stuff are using it on a day-to-day basis. Not for another 10 or 20 years. That's not the goal right now. The goal right now is Bitcoin needs to monetize. Bitcoin needs to reach a market capitalization of 5 trillion, 10 trillion, 15 trillion, etc. It needs to grow until that mass is so heavy that people don't even think in Bitcoin terms anymore. They're thinking in Satoshi terms. And that's when we have an opportunity to move to the next stage. The last thing I'll quickly say is that doesn't mean that we can't use Bitcoin for payments today. That doesn't mean Bitcoin can't function as a medium exchange today. That doesn't mean that you can't measure your goods and services in Satoshis. You just use it in an account. You can do all of these things. That's an individual preference. I do, for example, if people pay me to come on a speaking gig or they pay me for, my new book that's coming out or whatever, I do not accept dollars. I only accept Bitcoin. So I operate on a Bitcoin standard, but that's up to me because I understand what this thing is. The rest of the world, if they're a cafe or something, they might have input costs in US dollars or reals or euros or whatever. So they need to, they're dealing with a different set of primitives, and they need to decide for themselves at what point they adopt what capacity or what dimension of Bitcoin. So it's a super easy thing. It's a question of time. We'll get there. We just need to keep moving forward.
I really like the iPhone example because it's true, like this technological breakthrough, you would have assumed that once you have like a much quicker and convenient payment mechanism, once you got through the Bitcoin experience, everybody should adopt it. But it's true that also at stake is all your money and savings and assets. Okay, interesting. Because there's also another parallel that I tend to question is like when they invented the automobile, and the switch from the horse to the automobile was like in 1 year. Everybody was driving cars. What was at stake was not like your life's works or your life's savings. It was just your locomotion preference.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And it's not only what's at stake. So what's at stake is huge, but it's also who is pushing against it. Who's got something to lose, right? Like the horse and carriage industry might have been large, but it's definitely not as large as the central banking industry, the nation state, like everything like that. That Bitcoin's fighting a much larger war than the horse and carriage or the mobile phone. Like these
Oh,
things are tiny in comparison. It's a flea compared to an elephant.
okay. Interesting. Let's go now to your entrepreneurship side of things. So, can you tell us a little bit about your Amber journey?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, the aha moment for me was to build a Bitcoin application. I still remember how hard it was raising money in 2017, 2018, because I was fundamentally against the ICOs, the shitcoins, and all that sort of stuff. I said, what are people doing? They're like literally printing money out of thin air. They're doing the thing that's antithetical to Bitcoin. They're just making up a coin for whatever they want. And they're not even selling equity in the businesses. Like, it was driving me mad. And I would go out to investment conferences, and people would be, "So, what's your coin going to be?" And I said, "We don't need a coin." And they're like, "So, what do you mean? How are you going to raise money?" I said, "How has every company raised money for the last century?" I said, "I'm selling equity." And they'd look at me like I had three heads. They're like, "What do you mean selling equity?" I said, "Oh, I'm giving you a part of my company so that you have ownership stake." They're like, "How quickly can I get liquidity on my equity?" I said, "It's a startup. Like, what's wrong with you people?" And like, it took me a while. And then obviously the ICO bubble blew up. And then a bunch of the people that I'd spoken to over 2017, early 2018, they came back sheepishly. They're like, "Are you still accepting investment in the company?" "Well, yeah, sure." So, I finally, after about a year and a half of like bashing my head against the wall, I raised the capital for that. And yeah, we kind of like pioneered the Bitcoin savings, Bitcoin dollar cost averaging industry, which was fantastic. Now, after a couple of years of doing that, as I said, like late 2021, early 2022, I stepped down as CEO, like for many reasons. One, I was kind of done with dealing all the regulators and all the crap, and I'm not. I've got a very strong personality in the sense that I don't like to ask for permission or be told what to do all the time. And the regulatory framework for Bitcoin exchanges and products like this, on ramps, off ramps, and everything like that, it just keeps tightening and tightening and tightening, because that's the only place that the state and the banks can affect Bitcoin, right? They can't change the Bitcoin consensus rules. They can't change anything about Bitcoin. So it's the gateways that they can put pressure on. And I just kind of said, "Look, screw you people." And at that time, I didn't have any interest in going back to Australia after all the lockdown madness. So yeah, I stepped down from that and decided to shift my career focus more into writing. And we wrote the UnCommunist Manifesto with Mark Moss. That became a bestseller. It's still one of the better sellers in the political and economic sort of sphere on Amazon. And yeah, about a year after that, the itch hit me again. So early 2023, I thought, man, I need to build something. And I said, I refuse to build another Bitcoin business. There's enough wallets. I don't know anything about mining, so I'm not too interested in that. And there's no chance I'm doing another exchange because I refuse to deal with regulators. So I thought, what the hell can I do? And that's when I went down the AI rabbit hole. And yeah, I decided to try and build a Bitcoin language model. So we can talk about that. I don't know if there's anything else you want to ask about Amber specifically, but
Yeah,
that was
let's
sort of
let's finish the Amber part, and then we
okay.
go to the AI, which I'm keeping for the last because I think it's
Uh-huh.
the most interesting part. So you stepped down as CEO and
Hmm.
you exited. What did you do? You sold your shares, or you still like a
I'm
shareholder?
no, I'm still the largest shareholder in the company. Yeah. Um,
Okay,
I just don't. I don't want to run something when I'm not in the country and I'm not in agreement. I don't agree with the regulators, basically.
okay. And what were the pressure points from the regulator perspective that you found overstepping or
Oh, I mean
uh,
everything. The KYC stuff. Like for example, we had one big pressure point was they wanted me to track where the Bitcoin was being withdrawn to. Um, and I was like, why? I don't care. Like, this is this person's money. Like, the only way to buy Bitcoin on Amber was through their bank account. So, and they were KYC'd on the way in. It was their money from their bank account, And where they were withdrawing it was their business. I didn't want to build a surveillance company. And they kept pressuring us like, oh, you have to surveil, you have to introduce like, what was it? Chain analysis tools and all this sort of stuff. I said, no, 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 I refuse. And then there was other stuff from like the banks and like what they wanted us to do and extra, like all this sort of stuff. And I just really like, man, I like building beautiful products. I don't like building, what do you call it? Compliance traps. And, we found ourselves, like, I found myself hiring more compliance people instead of engineers. And I was like, well, what am I building here? Like, I don't want to build a bank. Like the whole point of Bitcoin is to like eliminate that stuff. So yeah, I kind of,
But having
you
dealt
call
with
it a
all these,
rage quit.
but having dealt with all these regulatory constraints, I would say, and the reasoning behind them, like I call it like the rise of the compliance officer. We're like in the age of the rise of the compliance officer, because every additional layer of compliance or regulatory requirement is only seen as a positive. There's no like a step back. There's always like a step
It's a ratchet. Yeah, it
and
ratchets, it
adding a
ratchets, it
layer.
ratchets. Yeah.
And how do you see it like ending? Because that's also like adoption resistance to Bitcoin, because the harder you make it for people to switch from the fiat system to the Bitcoin system and then use their Bitcoin to send money, to wire, etc. And we have seen like recently in the US a lot of Lightning network operators closing shop because of these regulatory
Stupid
risks.
laws. Yeah. Yeah.
And is there a scenario basically where compliance officers around the world just close or make it so difficult that it's practically closed to deal with Bitcoin? The same as you can see it with cash. You have less and less and less tolerance for cash, and perhaps it's going to disappear in 10 years. And can Bitcoin follow the same route?
Yeah. So I'm a student of war. My latest book is it looks at the samurai, the warring states, the ancient Greeks and Romans and Macedonians, the Christian West, and all this sort of stuff. And I spent a number of years just studying warfare on this. And in every battle, like we're in a war with the central banking system and the existing economic and monetary system. When you apply pressure in one place, you necessarily force an opening in another place. So this thing's a landscape. So as they make Bitcoin, or as they make the on-ramps more and more difficult, what happens is they don't only make their own, like the Bitcoin to fiat on-ramp more difficult, but Revolut and TransferWise and all of these neobanks and everything, like they all become harder to use. Your capacity to move money of any kind becomes harder to do. Like these days, TransferWise, for example, was one of my favorite financial services applications in the world. It's become almost impossible to use. Like for me to move any sum of money, like over $10,000, becomes a nightmare. Like if I want to, like the whole point of it was so that I could move money easily from the US to Brazil or to Australia or to Europe or whatever. It's becoming increasingly difficult. Like a couple months ago, I put a deposit down on a property in Brazil, or I wanted to, and Jesus Christ, the amount of paperwork and headache that I had to go through took me weeks just to move a deposit of $10,000. It was insane. So as they apply the pressure to these points, which will affect Bitcoin and everything else, what they do is it increases how good Bitcoin itself looks for direct transactions, and it increases people's desire, for example, to accept Bitcoin directly. So for example, me personally, I don't use exchanges anymore to buy Bitcoin. When I do any form of work, as I said earlier, whether it's I sell a book, I paid for a speaking gig, I'm paid for traveling to a conference, whatever the case is, anytime I do any sort of work and I get paid, I just get paid in Bitcoin and that's it. And what that does is it starts to actually drive up the circular economy. And that's actually really, really healthy, because now people are acquiring Bitcoin without being on exchanges and without being tracked, without being traced, and they're forced in a funny way to actually learn about Bitcoin, acquire Bitcoin, and become first-class Bitcoin citizens instead of just going through an exchange and treating it as investment. So as they constrict one area, they actually open the door for another area. And that's sort of how I see this happening. So like they're going to spend the next decade making it harder and harder and harder and harder and harder to buy Bitcoin. But that doesn't mean there's going to be no capital flows into Bitcoin. The capital flows are going to still continue. Bitcoin is still going to keep increasing purchasing power. The ETFs are still going to drive it up in price, all this sort of stuff, which means the existing Bitcoin holders, they're going to become increasingly wealthy. They will have increasing purchasing power. They will be more inclined to just want to pay people directly in Bitcoin, and people who can't get Bitcoin will be more inclined to directly accept it. And it's almost like creates the necessary pressure for circular economies to start to develop. And once again, we win the long-term war by fighting battles on multiple fronts. So we need to win these skirmishes. So it's our job now to start to educate people on, hey, so what if you can't buy it on an exchange? Earn the Bitcoin. Find a way to earn it. It's digital. Anyone can pay you anywhere. This is where Nostr comes in, all this other stuff. So that's my theory, and that's how like I kind of see the battlefield. Is we just need to lean in where it matters most.
Okay. Now let's switch to the UnCommunist Manifesto. How did you switch from the entrepreneurial side to the writing, and why did you decide to write this book? And without disclosing everything about the book, just
Yeah.
2 or 3
I mean,
ideas behind it.
yeah. So I've been a writer for a long time, and like I've written probably 1 or 2 million words on Bitcoin between like my personal blog, for Bitcoin Magazine, for all this sort of stuff. And UnCommunist came about almost as a joke. Actually, I was in El Salvador before actually the Bitcoin legal tender came into effect, and I was sitting there with Mark Moss, who's my co-author of the book, and he just randomly asked me a question. He said, "Oh, Alex, have you ever read the Communist Manifesto?" And I looked at him. I said, "Why the hell would I do that?" And he said, "It's really, really bad." And I said, "I'm sure it is." Like, couldn't think of a dumber book to try and read. And he just said something offhand. He said, someone should really write a rebuttal to this book, like, write something, different to this, because the statistic is something like it's one of the most widely read socio-political economic books in the world. I was like, Jesus Christ, that says a lot about why the world is so broken and stupid at the moment. So anyway, about 6 months later, this whole step down from Amber happened. I moved away, and I was just sitting there thinking, what the hell do I do next? And it hit me. So I called Mark up and I said, hey, that the book that we were talking about writing, we should write it. And at this stage, it wasn't called the UnCommunist Manifesto. We actually didn't know what to call it. We were thinking like the Libertarian Manifesto, or the Freedom Manifesto, or the Individualist Manifesto, the Sovereign. Like, we were throwing out all these names, and we're like, man, it all sounds so cringe. And we started writing it, and we emulated the format. And the book was originally going to be a rebuttal to the Communist Manifesto, but instead it took a different tack. It became its own message of hope, of freedom, of responsibility, of culture. So it's a very short book, and it's honestly, like, you take the greatest ideas from like Mises, Rothbard, like all these Austrian economics, libertarian principles, freedom principles, and you kind of condense it into 4 lessons. Like, what is the true definition of capitalism? It's a process, not a political modality. Is it oppressed versus oppressor, or is it the coercive collective versus the sovereign individual? So we kind of like changed a few dimensions, did all that. But the name came about in a funny way. We were at lunch with Mark's wife, and, we were saying these names, and we're like, no, I don't like that. No, that sounds stupid. This is cringe. And she said, why don't you just call it the UnCommunist Manifesto? And we kind of just like looked at each other. We're like, damn, that's a good name. And that's sort of how we went with the name. But the message is quite sharp, and it's not really a Bitcoin book. But honestly, I have orange pilled more people with that book than anything else, because there's only a single page. It's about 90 pages, so it's not a long book, but there's a single page on Bitcoin. But the case that we make for a functional world, the case that we make against communism as a process and as an ideology and as a political modality, the case that we make for free market, sound money, family, all this sort of stuff, all hinges on the existence of something like Bitcoin. So it's incredible. Like every time I've given that book to somebody, they come out and they're a Bitcoiner straight away. Like even though it's just a single page on it.
Oh, wow, great! Because I used to give the Bitcoin Standard. Now I'm gonna give this
It's
one instead.
the
It's
Bitcoin Standard is fantastic as the second book. If the problem is it's too long for people to start with, so you hit them with this. This is a stealth orange pill, and then they hit the Bitcoin Standard, and then they're like 100% sold. The Bitcoin maximalist straight away.
okay. Okay, now jumping to AI. How did you go from the UnCommunist Manifesto to AI? I mean, I suppose you jump into it when everybody started like being mind blown by all the technological achievements that were made. And
Kind of.
what did you find down that rabbit hole?
Kind of. So basically, I did a podcast back in 2021 or maybe 2022. I don't know what it was, but it was a podcast with a guy, and we dug into GPT-2 actually. So before GPT-3, and GPT-2 still sucked. And we concluded on the podcast that whatever, it's not that interesting. I mean, at least that's what I concluded, and he concluded that watch out, it's going to get a lot better. And I was like, yeah, whatever. So anyway, obviously he was right. A year and a half later, 2 years later, whatever it was, um, GPT-3 comes out, blows everybody away. We have discovered language. And I went back and listened to our podcast. I was like, damn, I should have been keeping a closer eye on this. But what interested me was, as a writer, this idea that a machine could now produce literature, could write, when it couldn't really do that before. And I was absolutely fascinated by it. I was like, this is incredible, blah, blah, blah. I want to build a business in here. And for me, honestly, sometimes the best way to learn something is to go and build something. And whether that's a product or a business or whatever, doesn't matter, but like go and build. Because as you build, you necessarily have to figure the thing out. So I, in the beginning, didn't set out to build a business. What I started doing was I taught myself how to fine tune basic models. I said, okay, I wanted to learn what vector databases were. I wanted to learn reinforcement learning. I wanted to learn fine tuning. I wanted to learn what do you call it? Retrieval enhancement. All the sort of the things. And I'm a fast learner, and as I said, I've got a background in like engineering, math, physics, all that sort of stuff. So I kind of find it easy to get into that space, and I did. And I came up. The original idea actually was to build a application for mentoring people. So I called it Mentor, which was like a blend of mentor and avatar. And the idea was to see if we could emulate personalities like living and dead. So like Jordan Peterson, Steve Jobs, Marcus Aurelius, Napoleon, Caesar, all this sort of stuff, and be able to have like an app where you could talk to them as your mentor, as your tutor, or something like that. Turned out that emulating personalities deeply is extremely, extremely, extremely hard. So we kind of tossed that idea out the window, and we stumbled onto building a Bitcoin language model. And I put together a couple friends. We raised a little bit of money with the idea of, hey, can we build basically a Bitcoin education tool, something that aggregates all of the knowledge in the Bitcoin space, all the books, all the articles, all the podcasts, all this sort of this powerful thinking, and build it into a language model which by default was a Bitcoin maximalist, like an Austrian economist, a Bitcoin maximalist in a model. And conceptually sounds like a great idea. Practically speaking, super hard, like super difficult. Like the amount of crap that goes into not only just like, because it's not a problem to source the data. There's a lot of data out there. When people say ChatGPT was trained on the whole internet, it's a total scam. ChatGPT was trained on 0.00000000001% of the internet. Like that's how much available clean data there is. It's basically nothing. Like we'll always have multiple orders of magnitude more dirty data that is useless for training a model than clean data. And we found out that the hard way, like when we were training the Bitcoin model, is that you can't just feed it the Bitcoin standard. No, you have to take the Bitcoin standard. You need to break it up into paragraphs. You then need to change the paragraph into a question and answer, assuming you want the model to answer in question and answer format. And then you need to feed each individual question answer of the entire book, and then you need to multiply that by every book, by every article, etc. So it's a massive job. In fact, most of the money in training models actually goes into data annotation and data structuring, not in even the training component. Like I would say it's about 80-20. Most of the work is on the back end. So we went through this process. We trained, we built out data sets, we trained models, we screwed around. We did that for like almost 9 months until we finally got one decent model that worked. And that's the current Spirit of Satoshi model that's out there. But we found at the end of all of this that there's no real economic model. Unlike traditional software, where the marginal cost of adding a user is effectively zero, uh, language models and AI products don't have that luxury. Every single user that uses a language model and asks a question actually costs compute. And the more users you have, the more that compute cost bloats. It's not a linear increase, it's an exponential increase, which is why someone like ChatGPT, for example, OpenAI, they're losing more money. Even though they have memberships, they're losing way more money than they're making, not only in the creation of the model and the training of the model and the data and all the stuff that goes in the backend, but in the usage of ChatGPT. And we just couldn't find an economic model that would work, and we couldn't find anyone that was willing to spend enough on running a Bitcoin model. So we came to the conclusion that, okay, cool, it's a great science experiment. It's pretty useful. Like we wrote a book, we wrote a Bitcoin book called 21 Questions with the model and with a bunch of other contributors like Giacomo Zucco, Samson Mao, and like Knut Svanholm and Guy Swan and all these people. And it's a great little beginner's book on Bitcoin, so people can find it if they search 21 Questions Bitcoin book on Amazon. But yeah, beyond that, like other than being an education tool, we integrated it into a few apps like Galloy and a couple other education apps. We were in talks with Swan about integrating it, but once again, they were a good example of someone who said, "Look, we love the idea, but it's just not worth more than a couple $100 a month." And the operating cost of the model is in the thousands per month. So just like the economics, once again, just didn't make sense. So we decided to just open source it, give it to the public. Anybody can use it. Anybody can download it. Anybody can run it locally. But yeah, I really discovered that the AI industry itself is one big scam. Like nobody's making money. There's only two people making money in AI. It is the compute, the cloud compute, and the compute people. So it's NVIDIA, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, or the people offering data annotation services like Scale AI and people like that, who are basically charged to structure and annotate and clean data. Other than that, all the other AI companies, I don't care if it's Anthropic or OpenAI or the one that just went bust that Bill Gates funded, they raised $1.2 billion. They were called Pi, and they were actually their model was really nice. They just went bust because they just couldn't find an economic model. So like nobody is making money other than the compute providers and that's why I think it's one big Ponzi scheme, because all these startups are coming around. They're not solving a real problem. It's almost like a solution in search of a problem. They're spending all this money. They're not making any money. And in my opinion, the AI space is going to have a massive, massive winter in the next 12 to 18 months. Like it's going to crash big time.
Okay, so to sum it up, don't buy AI companies or AI stocks. Come and buy
Run.
Bitcoin instead. It's a much safer investment and with a much better visibility.
100%. Like buying Bitcoin is a no-brainer. And if you really, really, really want to invest in a business, like either go a traditional business that actually makes money, like Uber, for example, is a fantastic business, or find Bitcoin businesses that make money. Like I just heard today on Twitter that Fold out of America, they're going to list on the Nasdaq. That's huge news. Fold is a fantastic company, very well run. Will is a good friend, and he's one of the best operators that I know. Like that's a company I would even personally sell Bitcoin to buy that business. Like that's the playbook. But all this AI shit, like there's probably still some money to be made, but that bubble is nearing. Honestly, it's gonna pop.
Okay. Unfortunately, our time is up. We have to wrap it up. Thanks a lot for joining the show.
Thank you.
So just Basically, as a brief summary, the Uncommon Manifesto, people can find it on Amazon, I suppose. And
Yes.
do you have other stuff that you want to share with our audience to learn and educate themselves about Bitcoin?
Sure. I mean, if people just go to my Twitter, so Svetsky writes, like writing WRITES. I'm sure the links will be in the show notes, or my link tree actually, linktree.com/Svetsky. Everything is in there. I do, yeah. I still write. I mean, I've got a Substack. It's got about 20,000-30,000 subscribers, so people can join that if they want to. I don't write about Bitcoin as often. My old Medium has all of my old Bitcoin stuff. But yeah, the UnCommunist Manifesto, the new book Bushido of Bitcoin comes out, and yeah, the project that we've been working on from the beginning of the year, the Nostr one, which you and I can discuss in a future call, is called Satlantis. But we're basically using the Nostr network as basically a social graph as a service. And I'm so bullish on this. I think this is going to be it's the thing that the world's sleeping on. Like while everyone's distracted with AI and all the other crap, Nostr I think is going to be the biggest thing to hit the world over the next 5 years. Honestly,
Okay, thanks a lot, Alex. Very interesting insights, and I hope to speak to you soon for another round as soon as your new book will be out.
fantastic. Thank you, Jad. Appreciate it.
Take care.